Hello, everybody. My name is Tim Bryant. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist working in field crop entomology here at Virginia Tech. I'm not located on main campus. I'm at a agriculture experiment station in the southeastern part of the state. So really, this is kind of the heart of the field crop production area of Virginia, which allows us to be kind of close to our stakeholders and work with them directly. So my crop responsibilities are corn, cotton, peanuts, and soybeans. But obviously today I'll be talking about soybean insect pest management. And the focus of my talk today is on a regional effort in collaboration with members of the S1080 Soybean Insect Management Working Group, and some things that we are trying to work on together to better amplify the research that we're doing and help our stakeholders. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. Um, so we're really not talking about one specific insect pest of soybeans today. This is really a project that encompasses all of the things that you might find causing an economic problem for soybean production throughout the soybean region of the U.S. And it's kind of easy to look at these in a few major groups of different feeding niches that these insects operate in a soybean plant. So you have stem feeders. These are things like the three-cornered alfalfa hopper here in the top left, Dectes stem borer, kudzu bugs. These are all things that are feeding on the stem via a stylet, feeding on the vascular system of the plant, or in the case of the stem borer, as the name suggests, the larvae bores into the plant. Then you have defoliators. These are things that are feeding on the leaves of soybeans and causing defoliation. And that's namely a few caterpillar pests, including the soybean looper here on the top, green cloverworm, there's velvet bean caterpillar, corn earworm can be a defoliator in some cases if it shows up prior to pods and flowers being available, and then a couple different beetle species and bean leaf beetle and Mexican bean beetle. Then you have pod feeders. These are things that are feeding directly on the reproductive structures of a soybean plant, and that's stink bugs. Stink bugs feed with a straw-like mouth part, a stylet, and they're feeding directly on the seed. And then corn earworm, which you'll notice is here in the pod feeders, that's the main mechanism of injury that it causes to soybean plants and feeding directly on flowers and pods. But again, it can also be a defoliator in some cases. And then you have the others that don't fit cleanly into my three groups here. So that's things like slugs, which are actually not an insect, but they don't fit cleanly into anyone else's responsibilities. So typically dealing with slugs falls to us as entomologists. Two-spotted spider mites, same thing, also not an insect, but kind of falls under the category of insect management. And some other more minor pests like potato leafhopper. So these all do different types of injury to soybean plants. The stem feeders, as I alluded to, things like three-cornered alfalfa hoppers and kudzu bugs will feed directly on the stem. And this often causes this kind of girdling injury that you see here, pointed to by this black arrow. And that just limits the plant's ability to uptake water and nutrients throughout the season, indirectly affecting yield potential. And then also a major issue when you have this girdling on the stem is that late in the season, when you get storms or high winds or things like that, this can lead to lodging, which causes harvest issues. Dectes stem borer, you can see in this bottom image here, is the larvae bores into the stem and causes the same kinds of issues that you would see with the girdling from the kudzu bug or the three-cornered alfalfa hopper. It just limits the overall vigor of that plant and can lead to lodging late in the season. The defoliators are just feeding on leaf tissue. So here you can just see degrees of severity for defoliators feeding on leaf tissue. And our economic thresholds, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail about later on, are actually based on the amount of feeding that they've done rather than a number of insects. The pod feeders, the corn earworm kind of takes a brute force approach. This is an insect that has chewing mouth parts, so it chews through the pods directly onto the developing seed, like you can see in this image here. And then stink bugs are actually feeding through the pod with that straw-like mouth part. So that can either lead to the seed being aborted, like you see a couple of these shriveled seeds or seeds that didn't develop at all. But it can also lead to quality issues. Some discoloration on some of these seeds that you see in this image here. And then the others, uh, slugs are a major early season pest of soybean in a lot of areas, and you can see they're feeding there on the cotyledon stage soybean plant. This is two-spotted spider mite injury. So, various mechanisms of how these things contribute to potential yield loss in soybeans. In the case of slugs, it's stand loss early in the season, um, or having to replant. Two-spotted spider mites and potato leafhoppers just again contribute to a loss of vigor in that plant, which can ultimately result in a reduction in yield. So there's a lot of different insect pests, and they feed on different parts of the plant at different stages throughout the season. So this is a figure from a publication from the University of Maryland that just demonstrates nice and cleanly when these different pests that I've just described can be an issue in soybean production throughout a season. So when you're talking about North Dakota versus Alabama, your mileage may vary on where these bars kind of fall on this timeline of when these pests are a problem. But what it illustrates is that, a grower who wants to be really on top of all these different things has to be aware of different things at different times and know what they're looking for, and what that injury looks like, and how many of those pests actually cause an issue. So I mentioned what I'm talking about today is a regional effort. So this is our soybean production area in the United States. Obviously, it's heavily concentrated in the Midwest down through the Mississippi Delta. I'm located right here in Suffolk County, Virginia, in the southeastern part of the state. So we talked about all these different pests and when they might be an issue throughout the season, but obviously the area down here in Louisiana versus way up here in North Dakota, what pests they're dealing with or potentially not dealing with, is going to vary quite a bit from year to year. So, things like two-spotted spider mites or soybean aphids are often more common in the Midwest. Slugs are a big issue in the Mid-Atlantic, up into the Midwest and Ohio. Cornea worm, soybean loopers are more of a Southeast issue oftentimes. And then there's things like red-banded stink bug, which is difficult to control pest that's primarily found in the Mid-South region. Um, so again, there's extension specialists in every one of these states, and they're all kind of dealing with different issues. And that's clearly demonstrated here, in this publication from the Crop Protection Network. So extension specialists from a number of different states contribute to this, and it's kind of categorized by region. So you have the southern region here at the top, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin here in the middle, and then Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri down here at the bottom. And what this is just an estimate of how much economic loss each one of these insect pests causes to soybean production in that region. So obviously not every extension specialist is scouting every single acre of soybeans in their state. These are just estimates, but it provides a pretty good snapshot of what's important in these different regions. And you can see that, it's pretty different. So in the southern region, stink bugs are major pests, cornea worm, soybean loopers, some of the things that we deal with here in Virginia pretty frequently. But as you get into these kind of more Midwestern regions, you're dealing more with things like Japanese beetles, slugs, bean leaf beetle, green clover worm, spider mites. So again, all I'm demonstrating here is that there's a lot of different insect pests and their degree of importance to different soybean production regions varies. This is another publication that's similar to the one I just talked about from the Crop Protection Network, where extension specialists contribute to insect loss estimates for their state. And in 2024, the cost of insect losses, so yield that was lost as a direct result of insect feeding, plus the cost of control for those insects in 2024 was about 890 million US dollars. And our goal as extension specialists is to basically make that a smaller number. That's what our job boils down to. We're trying to develop solutions and strategies to lessen that burden on our growers, and either more effectively manage insects so they're spending less money on it, or in some cases, potentially not trying to manage insects where it's not needed. So I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So how do we address insect pests of soybeans? The thing that we always push is what's called integrated pest management, or IPM. And this figure here is kind of a good representation of what that entails. So it's like an old food pyramid, where the bottom one here is kind of what you're relying on most heavily, up to the top as kind of a last resort in chemical control. And in field crops, with the scale that we're working at, um, really, we don't implement a lot of mechanical or physical control, or biological control, in the sense that we would be releasing beneficial insects like they could in, say, a greenhouse or a specialty crop production system. We're really relying heavily on some of these agronomic practices, and decision support tools down here at the bottom. So that's things like choosing the right planting date that's going to minimize your risk, crop rotation, conservation biological control. So using strategies that are going to promote naturally occurring biological control agents, things like minute pyropugs, lacewings, lady beetles. Um, so this kind of fits into biological control up here, but really it's more something that you're doing prior to a pest ever showing up in the field. It's decisions that you're making to promote these just naturally occurring rather than releasing or augmenting that population. And then you're also monitoring for pests, right? So you're using active monitoring tools in a sweep net or a drop cloth. There's passive monitoring tools. So we have a corneora monitoring network in Virginia, for example, that allows growers to see when moths are flying around, and then they can use that information to go and scout a field using an active sampling tool. So all of that is occurring before an insect ever shows up. These are all things that growers are doing to try to set themselves up for success and hopefully minimize the risk of an insect that can be a pest showing up and reaching a population level that will cause economic loss. But ultimately, that's, not going to always be the case. Probably a pest is going to show up, and you're going to end up at the top of the pyramid here with chemical control, where a pest has reached a level where you need to intervene and spray something for that. And ideally, that's going to occur at the economic threshold. Um, so the economic threshold is the point at which the cost associated with the loss at that population of the insect is equal to the cost of control. So in this little figure here, the economic threshold is here, and then, or the economic injury level rather. And then we set the economic threshold just below that. So when you intervene, you never actually reach that economic injury level, and that spray that you've gone out and applied actually has return on investment for the grower. So there's economic thresholds for all these different pests. Sometimes it's based on a number of insects. In the case of a lot of our defoliators, it's based on the amount of feeding that we've done, or the insect has done. And these are pretty well established in a lot of cases for most of these pests. And these are things that we push all the time. And we have things like our field crop pest management guide that lays out all these different thresholds in different scenarios. Double crop, full season beans, these are defoliation thresholds, our stink bug thresholds. And every extension specialist in every state has some version of this, where their growers are able to access it easily and see what that economic threshold is. So we have these tools. We try to keep growers informed on what pests might occur, when they might be there, what the injury looks like, how you sample for them, and then at what level you should go out and intervene. Despite all of that, again, going back to this publication, about 7% of the total costs associated with managing insects across this US soybean production area are attributed to just an automatic insecticide application. So that's about 65 million US dollars of that 890 million that we talked about earlier. And this is just a spray that's going out for no specific target insect pest. It's sort of an insurance spray. Oftentimes, what we'll hear is, I'm going to go out and spray a fungicide because this is the right growth stage to do that. And because I'm doing that, I'm just going to throw an insecticide in there and I'll get whatever's out there. When you look at individual states from this soybean insect loss report, and some of them up to 50% of the soybean acres are treated with this kind of auto spray. More often than not, it's going to be a pyrethroid. These are broad spectrum insecticides. Usually they are anywhere from maybe $2 to $6 an acre. So really cheap. And a lot of growers view it as kind of cheap insurance. And when they're going across the field anyway, they're going to throw it in there. Um, there's a few reasons why that doesn't pay off. So why does it pay to scout and avoid those automatic applications? Well, the first reason would be that some fields are never going to reach an economic threshold. Some fields might not have any pest of any kind really throughout the season. There's natural biological control agents. Some of these pests are migratory, and their dispersal patterns may vary from year to year, depending on the immediately surrounding landscape or weather conditions or whatever it may be. But not every soybean field in every year is going to reach an economic threshold for a pest. So, if that's the case in a given field, that application may never be needed throughout the season, and that right there is a cost savings. The second point here is that insecticide selection, what you choose to go out and spray, should be totally dependent on the target pest. And one of the primary reasons for that is insecticide resistance. So with the automatic application of choice being a pyrethroid, a lot of these materials have limited efficacy for some of the most important target pests. So in Virginia, two examples here that we often deal with are soybean loopers and corn earworm. On the left here, we're looking at soybean looper and some insecticide efficacy data from this production season in 2025. So this red line here is an untreated control, and this is just total number of soybean loopers. And then this kind of yellow mustard line here is Warrior 2. The active ingredient in that is lambda-cyhalothrin, and that is a broad spectrum pyrethroid, very commonly used. And you can see here at 5 days after treatment, that was about the same, if not maybe just slightly worse than not spraying anything at all for this particular insect. So this is one that's been resistant to pyrethroids for a number of years now. So if you're going out and making that auto application and you do have soybean loopers at threshold and they need to be treated, this particular application, if you go with that broad spectrum pyrethroid, is not going to be effective. So just like if you sprayed and you didn't have an insect, you're spraying for an insect where that insecticide's not going to work very well. And again, you're just wasting that application cost essentially. The same could be said for corn earworm. So this data here is from 2003. So this was 2 entomologists ago. I started here in 2024. And this is percent survival of adult corn earworm moss in cypermethrin treated vials. So cypermethrin, another common pyrethroid insecticide. You could see that, it used to be pretty effective for corn earworm way back in 2003 through 2007. And then that percent survival started to jump up here. And in the last couple of years, we've had over 50% survival on average for these corn earworm moss to cypermethrin. So two examples of pests that are important here in Virginia that would not be effectively managed with an automatic application of a pyrethroid. The third thing is that these broad spectrum applications, particularly when they're put out earlier in the season, are going to eliminate all these beneficial insects that you've hopefully promoted through all these agronomic practices that we've discussed. And when you eliminate all those beneficial insects, it kind of knocks out the balance of that ecosystem in that crop field. And oftentimes what that leads to is a flare up of later pests. So these are just some of the things that might be out in a soybean field. There's assassin bugs or wheel bugs here. There's predatory stink bugs. Lacewings, lady beetles are really common. When you knock those out with a broad spectrum application early in the season, they're no longer feeding on particularly these soft, small, the small soft-bodied insects like aphids and spider mites. And usually or not usually, but oftentimes what you see is that when you knock these out, these things flare up later in the season. And then you have another issue where you have to go and spray again. So even if that earlier application was effective for something, sometimes what it leads to is having to make another application later down the road for a different target pest. So I mentioned this working group. The S1080 is the Improving Soybean Arthropod Pest Management in the U.S. Um, National Multi-State Working Group, and it encompasses soybean specialists throughout the U.S. And we have an annual meeting every year where we kind of give updates on what's going on in our state, some of the things that we're working on, and we had a discussion this past year, early in 2025, on what kind of unites us and things that we could do regionally that would be beneficial to all of our stakeholders. Because the pest pressures that we face are really different across these different areas. But the uniting feature across all of these specialists and all the growers in all these different areas is that these automatic insecticide applications are pretty common across this entire region. So somebody said, the number one pest that we have across this entire region is an automatic insecticide application at R3. So given that, we initiated an effort this year to kind of develop some data to demonstrate exactly what we push every year in our extension meetings, which is that it pays to scout and to make these decisions based on what's actually occurring in the field rather than this growth stage based application. So these are the states that participated in it this past year. Obviously, I'm here at Virginia Tech, and it went all the way up to North Dakota State University and all the way down to LSU. So it represents a massive area geographically and a massive difference in what pests are important in these different regions, the production system, all these different factors that are different across these areas. But hopefully what the goal of this is to demonstrate that whatever your extension specialist is recommending in that area in terms of scouting and management and economic thresholds holds up and provides return on investment. So this was the study design that we used to address that. It was just 3 treatments, 1 untreated, the second being an automatic application at R3 of a broad spectrum pyrethroid. This is the most common time for a grower to go out and spray a fungicide. So that's often when that insecticide gets thrown in the tank as well. And then the third treatment is just following your local extension recommendations. And basically what this means is if I were to get a call and a grower said, hey, here's what I'm dealing with, here's the number of insects I have in the fields, here's the defoliation level, whatever I would recommend to them in that situation is the treatment that we applied to the plots with this third treatment here. So we're just following our recommendations, and obviously that varied depending on the state and the insect pressure there, but it compared what we would recommend with this automatic application and then in reference to an untreated. So these are in small replicated plots. They're at least 4 rows, 35 feet in length, replicated 4 times at each site. And we tried to plant this at kind of the later end of the full season soybean window. So this kind of encourages insect pressure a little bit more so that we have good pressure to test our hypothesis here, but it's still kind of within the agronomic window for each one of these study sites. And then we took weekly sweep net samples for different pests and beneficial insects, and then also took visual samples for injury. So in our case, we took percent defoliation ratings, but in some places, folks were more interested in a 1 to 5 injury rating for 2-spotted spider mites, or a soybean aphid insect or injury rating. So that varied by location. And again, we had 11 states participating in 2025. This was our study site here in Suffolk, Virginia. And I'm just going to focus on our results from Virginia for the sake of this talk. We're still collecting some of the data from other project participants and summarizing it. And again, it's it's 1 year of data so far. So we'll be continuing this moving forward and hopefully generate a robust data set. So we sampled in Virginia weekly, and ultimately what we ended up with was we hit our defoliation threshold for soybean loopers. So this was our field here. This was one of our untreated plots, and you can see the percent defoliation here. Um, this was what we'd call about 20% defoliation. You'd see a little bit closer up here on the right. So ultimately, we did our R3 spray, our automatic application, and then we ended up spraying at our defoliation threshold for soybean loopers. And the data I'm going to show here is primarily related to that. So this is our soybean looper counts. Our red dotted line here are two different applications. So this was the R3 application, that automatic spray of a pyrethroid. And then we ended up spraying at our defoliation threshold around September 3rd, which was quite a bit later than our automatic application. And you can see here. And the thing to take away from this is that that R3 application went out long before soybean loopers even really showed up in that field. Pyrethroids are not products that have a lot of residual control. So, you know, this R3 application went out and the loopers started to show up, and they were initially knocked down a little bit here and the kind of the subsequent weeks after making that automatic application. But you can see they peaked here on September 2nd, and through the rest of the season, we actually had more soybean loopers in the plots that got that automatic application than we did in the untreated control. And one of the potential mechanisms of that is that we knocked out some of those beneficial insects. And then as our threshold spray, you know, the loopers peaked the highest of the three treatments. But once we hit our defoliation threshold, we went out and sprayed a product called Intrepid Edge, which is much more effective for managing soybean loopers than a pyrethroid would be. And once we made that threshold application, we knocked them out and they stayed low through the end of the season until the whole population kind of crashed here by the end of September. So our threshold again for these is not actually based on the number of insects. It's based on percent defoliation. So that's what we're showing here. Again, our R3 spray here early in the season. And during reproductive stages of soybean development, our defoliation threshold in Virginia is 15%. So that's shown here in this black dotted line. And you can see the percent defoliation actually remained pretty low in that automatic application, which didn't necessarily jive with the soybean looper numbers like we would have expected it to. But you can see in the untreated control that percent defoliation just kept going up through the season until it kind of leveled off here in mid-September. And then in the threshold treatment, we got up above our threshold and we made our application, and then it leveled off and decreased or stayed about the same through the end of the growing season. And here I'm just showing an NDVI image of this field. This image was taken on September 17th. So right here, if you're looking at the figure, and I've color coded these boxes for the plots based on the colors you see here on the graph. So the red is our untreated control. The blue was where the treatment was made at the thresholds, and the green is where it was made at R3. So you can see the heavy defoliation and the untreated control here, and then a little bit less here in the threshold treatment and in the automatic application at R3. So then when we look at beneficial insects, again, our automatic application at R3, and then our threshold treatment, the product Intrepid Edge that we sprayed for loopers at the threshold is a little bit friendlier on beneficial insects. So you can see in our threshold treatment, you know, after we made that application, it didn't knock down the population significantly. In fact, it increased a little bit here through the end of the season. And that automatic application, the beneficial population went down to basically none in the several weeks following that application, and it never really bounced back. So the difference that we see in beneficial insects here might contribute in some part to the difference that we saw in the total number of soybean loopers in that previous figure. So then ultimately, this is kind of the most important thing that we look at here, and that's the yield of these plots. So we have our three treatments here, the untreated, the automatic application at R3, and then where we sprayed at an average percent defoliation of 18% on September 3rd. And we had no significant difference between these different treatments and the yield that we got. There is a numerical difference. The threshold treatment was about 7 bushels higher than the untreated, but you can see the variation in the yield from that standard error bar there. This suggests a couple of things potentially. One being that our defoliation threshold may be a little too conservative here at 15%. My colleague at NC State just this year increased their defoliation threshold during these reproductive stages to 25%. So that may be something that we need to look into here in Virginia. But the take-home message of this figure here is that the untreated and the automatic application at R3 were not statistically different in the yield potential. So if you're looking at a situation where you didn't reach this threshold, and you made this application for no particular target insect, you're not getting a yield benefit from that application. So in that case, there's just unnecessary input costs. So I'll just show a quick snapshot of the other locations that I have data from so far this year. And the thing I want to show you here mostly is that these two locations from Mississippi did not make an application for their threshold plots. So they essentially just had two sets of untreated controls. And when you look at the yield data from those two locations, there was no difference in yields between any of these treatments, the automatic application, the threshold, and the untreated. And in this case, the threshold is really the same as the untreated because they didn't reach a threshold for any particular insect pest. So in these two cases, you're looking at an input cost savings of about $6 an acre on average when you don't make this automatic application at R3. North Carolina was a similar story to Virginia. They made an application for both stink bugs and soybean loopers at a similar stage as we did in Virginia. But again, no significant difference in the yield there, although there was numerical difference on average with that threshold treatment. So just to summarize here, in Virginia, our R3 application was made prior to soybean loopers arriving in these plots, which was the only pest that reached an economic threshold. So this automatic application in this case was really before anything showed up that would need to be managed. The beneficial insect population recovered in our threshold-based application, but not in the auto spray. So if we had something like soybean aphids or two-spotted spider mites late in the season, having that beneficial insect population still be present would be beneficial for that. And ultimately, we didn't observe a difference in yields between the treatments at any of the 4 locations that I've showed you. So what we're starting to demonstrate here, and hopefully we'll continue to as we get more data from different sites and more years of the study under different pests and environmental conditions, is that these automatic applications usually aren't going to provide a return on investment for the grower, and that it really does pay to scout. So we're going to summarize the data that we got from this year, and we're going to add additional sites in 2026, in addition to replicating it at the sites we had this year. And again, our long-term goal is just to demonstrate the value of scouting and IPM, and we're going to hopefully do that across a wide range of production systems and pest pressures. And then we'll have regional data so that an extension specialist in North Dakota can say, here's the data that I have for our state, and here's what I would recommend you do to get best return on investment. And here's how that also works across all these different areas and different production systems. So if you have any questions on any of this, I'd be happy to be contacted here at my email. I'll put a quick plug in for my X account here. We share updates on trials like this throughout the season, timely updates that are hopefully helpful to our stakeholders. And then I'd just like to acknowledge all the different specialists, researchers, and extension specialists at all these different universities that had some version of this trial this year. I won't read all their names, but you can see them all listed here. And then I just want to thank my team here at the Tidewater AREC, our entomology program team. There's a lot of work to sample these plots every week throughout the season, and they stuck with it, and we got some good data from it. And then the soybean agronomy team here at the Tidewater AREC was also instrumental in executing this effectively. So that's all I have, and I thank everyone for your time.